great privilege of sitting with a woman who had terminal breast cancer. And when I met her, she was about 1 week from the end. And I sat down there with her in the hospital and held her hand. And the question she asked me, I suppose I should have expected it, but I was very, very early on in my ministry career at the time. She looked at me and she said, "Pastor, what's going to happen when I die?" And so I took her to the place where Jesus is talking to this criminal who's hanging next to him on the cross. And he says to that man, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." And so that's the answer that I was able to give her that day, was that, yes, when you pass on, you're going to be with Jesus right away. That's where you're going to be. But that actually made me think a little bit more deeply about that sort of a question. Like, how should I answer that? How should I answer that in a way that's not just going to be, okay, you'll go to be with Jesus, but how can I give a fuller answer of that? And that's part of what I want us to consider this morning. What do we mean when we say the word heaven? What do we mean when we say that when I die, I'm going to go to heaven? What do we actually mean by that? It's a really important question for us because, well, some of us it's going to happen sooner than others. None of us have any idea when it's going to happen, but all of us are going to die someday. And we're going to be on our way to either heaven or not heaven, to hell, right? And so we have to think about this. What do we actually mean by this word? And I have a feeling that a lot of people think the same way that I thought for a very long time. And that is, well, I didn't really have a strong understanding of it or idea of it, but I just sort of imagined a half-disembodied life floating around in clouds or in some other plane of existence. Or, I would sort of hold that in tension with this whole idea that, my mom always told me that we're going to be walking on streets of gold. And, I also was told that, one day we're just going to be in a place that's better than anything we can imagine. And that might be true. But there's actually a lot more to it than that. The Bible tells us a lot more than that. In fact, the Bible paints an entirely different picture than just a place that's better than we can imagine or floating around in clouds. What the Bible teaches us is that we are looking forward to a real physical existence in a real kingdom that's got real people in it and is ruled by a real king. Otherwise, what would be the point of Jesus coming back to life again in a real body? I'm starting here today with our passage because Matthew framed his whole gospel in the context of prophecy about this real king being fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus, who was a real man, someone who people saw and they touched, they heard what he said, and who made God-sized claims about himself. Then he backed up those God-sized claims by doing God-sized things. And we've been reading about some of that in the last few weeks when he was on the top of the mountain and he was preaching that Sermon on the Mount, and he was saying things like, in order to come to the Father, you've got to come through me. He's basically talking like he's the one who stands at the gate of heaven, and when you come to that gate, you've got to go through him to get there. So that's a God-sized claim, isn't it? And then he comes down from the mountain, and the first person he meets is somebody who has a skin disease that makes it so that he cannot touch or be in contact with any other people around him. And what's Jesus do? He touches the man, and the man becomes clean. And then he meets this centurion that we talked about last week, this Roman soldier who had such amazing faith in Jesus. And what's Jesus do? He commands. He speaks a word, and the Roman centurion's servant is healed. And so he made God-sized claims, and now he's doing God-sized things to back up those claims. And Matthew is framing all of this in the context of him fulfilling the messianic prophecy of the Old Testament. Messianic prophecy that's pointing towards a real person who will come, whom God will send, and who will redeem his people. That's where we're starting today, because at the very end of our passage, which we just read, verse 17, we find these words of Matthew. He says, this was to fulfill. This, the dismissing of Peter's mother-in-law's fever, the expelling of evil spirits from people and healing a whole lot of other sick people. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. So he's framing these miracles in messianic terms, that Jesus is bearing away these afflictions, and that somehow this is a fulfillment of this Old Testament passage. But what does that actually mean? Well, whenever we see an Old Testament passage quoted in the New Testament, there's something that we should do. We should flip back to the Old Testament and read a little bit of that and see, well, what was he actually trying to tell us here? What is he actually communicating? Well, what he did was he quoted Isaiah 53, verse 4. So we're going to go back to Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 6. And I don't have a slide for this, so if you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open them up to Isaiah 53. And just for a little bit of information, a little bit of context, this is one of what we call the servant songs, particularly the suffering servant songs. There's these group of writings that Isaiah made that he was inspired by God to write down, where he starts talking about this person who's going to come someday in the future. Remember, this is 900 years before Jesus came. Someone's going to come in the future. And this person is going to fulfill the purposes of God in the world. He's going to redeem his people. And he's going to establish an everlasting kingdom. And so this is what we find in Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 6. Who has believed what they heard from us? And to whom has the arm of Adonai been revealed? The arm of the Lord. He's talking about that person. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we counted him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and Adonai has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Does that sound familiar? We tend to read that passage of Isaiah around Christmas time, right? Because that's when we're talking about the fulfillment of that prophecy, when that person actually came, when Jesus was born. And that's where Matthew is taking us today as well. He's pointing us back to this idea of a suffering servant, someone who's going to suffer for his people in order to save them and in order to accomplish the purposes of God in the world. So the arm of the Lord in this passage, the king whom God is going to send. Now in verse 4, you might have noticed that the words are a little bit different. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. And when Matthew quotes it, he says, he took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Now, that might sound kind of strange, but actually if you go back to the original language, the Hebrew as it's written in the Old Testament, those words have a very wide range of meaning, and they're very difficult to translate, especially, to English, where we're trying to have this very, very specific idea of what these words mean. But they're actually really wide. They're wide enough to accommodate both grief and illness, both suffering and disease. And so this is what we find in Jesus, that he is the one who has come, and he's the one who's going to take up and bear away everything from our griefs and sorrows all the way to our sicknesses and diseases. He took them and he bore them away. So we think about Jesus for a minute, that he's the one who came. He took on humanity, right? So up there it says that, he didn't have any glory that we would be attracted to him, and we didn't esteem him. We didn't look at him and think he was great, because they're looking at him at that time. Anyone who saw Jesus when he was on the earth would have looked at him and seen a man. He didn't look particularly glorious at that time. And yet, appearances can, sometimes lead you a little bit astray, because Jesus was much, much more than a man. So he took on humanity. He experienced our weaknesses. Jesus got hungry. Jesus got tired. Sometimes you just wanted to be alone. You find that all throughout the New Testament. And then he goes around and he's restoring people to health. Well, how is that bearing diseases and taking away illnesses? Well, if you think about it, where is Jesus going? Jesus is going to the cross, where he's going to die. Well, what's that all about? If you think about it, our diseases and our sicknesses are actually stops on the way to death. It's death at work in our bodies. And what Jesus is going to do is he's going to go to the cross and he's going to absorb all of that. He's going to absorb all the consequences of human sin into his own body, and he's going to die. And in that way, he's taking away our griefs, our sorrows, our sickness, and our death. And so then what we see happening then, when Jesus comes out he's coming down the mountain, he goes into Peter's mother-in-law's house, and he dismisses her fever, and then he's healing these people who have demonic afflictions. What we're really seeing here is a foreshadowing, or foretaste, of what life in his kingdom is going to be like. So Jesus' healing ministry foreshadows the wholeness and the fullness of life that we will experience in his real kingdom. There's two types of afflictions that we're going to be set free from in his kingdom that we read about in this passage today. And the first one, this foreshadowed, we find in verses 14 and 15. I'll just read this again for us. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose again to serve him. Now, first of all, we have to recognize that this is actually a miraculous event. We don't think about fevers as being too serious of a thing these days. But back then, before they had antibiotics and other things, fevers could be pretty serious. And not only that, but even today, when we take medicine for our fevers, they don't generally disappear immediately, do they? I mean, the medicine holds it back a little bit, but then the medicine wears off and your fever comes back until you finally get better. But what's Jesus do? He reaches out, he touches her hand, and the fever's gone. That's it. And I think that what we learn from this about the real kingdom of Jesus, that we will one day be present in, physically present in, is that in his kingdom, we are going to be free from physical afflictions of any kind. So we see Jesus demonstrating his divine authority. And then right after that, Peter's mother-in-law, she's healed, and her response to him is really beautiful. She gets up and she starts to serve him. The word there is pretty interesting. It's actually the word that we get the word deacon from in English. She gets up and she starts serving him. That's what deacon basically means, is somebody who cares for the physical needs of others. And so she gets up and she starts serving him, most likely food. Now, okay, so let's think about this fever for a second, because what I really want to impress upon you today is that even fevers are a consequence of human sin. Even fevers are a consequence of human sin. So think about that. I think I mentioned this a little bit a moment ago. The ultimate consequence of human sin is death, right? So when Adam and Eve were in the garden, God said to them, "Do not eat from the fruit of this tree, because in the day that you eat of it, you will die." And so they go ahead and they do that anyway, and what happens? They eventually die. So death is the consequence of human sin. And right now, death is pervading our whole world. It's become a fact of life for us. We're all progressing towards it. Our diseases and our illnesses, as I said a moment ago, are all stops on the way to death. And so even fevers are part of that. And so when Jesus dismissed that fever and when he healed other people, in a sense what he was doing was pushing back death that was at work in the bodies of people. He was pushing that back. And since that is the consequence of sin, this pushing back of death when he was healing people was in anticipation of going to the cross where he was going to heal them. In anticipation of his own death, in which he was going to break the consequences of sin. He was going to break death by coming back to life again. So in Jesus' kingdom, we are going to be completely free from the physical consequences of sin. No more sickness, no more disease. Just real, abundant life in everlasting bodies. I'm looking forward to that. I mean, for some of you younger people, death might seem like a very far-off thing. And it still seems like a far-off thing to me. But, you know, when I look in the mirror and I realize that the wrinkles are getting deeper and my hairs are getting gray on the side, then I realize I'm a little bit closer to that than I was before. When I think, you know, 20 years ago was my 18th birthday. 20 years from now is going to be my 58th birthday. Am I doing my math right? I hope so. And, you know, it's something that, you know, that I'm confronted with every day now. That every day that goes by, I'm progressing closer and closer to the day that I'm going to meet Jesus. But I have a great hope about that now. Because I understand that it's not just going to be, you know, floating about in clouds that I'll be doing later on. It'll be living in a real kingdom with a body that's not broken. A body that doesn't have, you know, acid reflux or gray hairs or, you know, all the other sorts of problems that we end up having in our lives. No more fevers. I get sick pretty often, actually. I wish I had the constitution of my wife. She never gets sick. But we are going to be in real bodies with no more sickness, no more disease in Jesus' real kingdom. There's another type of affliction that is foreshadowed that we'll be free from in Jesus' kingdom in verse 16. It says, that evening they brought to him, so I'm assuming this is the people of Capernaum where Jesus was at the time. Maybe the people who saw him with the centurion, the people who saw him heal the leper. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. So in Jesus' kingdom, we're also going to be free from all spiritual afflictions. Now this is where a lot of us who've been raised with a very materialist worldview, we sort of run into a wall here, don't we? A lot of us have this belief or this understanding that the entire universe is only made up of what we can see and touch in front of us. But the Bible presents us with a different view. The Bible tells us there's a whole lot more to the universe than that. And I would just like to briefly sort of set this before you that a materialist worldview is our problem, not the Bible's problem. The Bible tells us there's a lot more to the world than that. And so we have Jesus casting out these evil spirits that were afflicting people. And it's really interesting. There's another interesting point about this that we might miss because we're not really in the first century. And a lot of us come from Western countries where, you know, we have absolutely no experience with spiritual things at all. And, you know, if a demon popped up right in front of us, we'll think we had a bad lunch or something. Well, Jesus casts these demons out with a word of command. It says he cast them out with a word. Just a word. And that's really surprising because when you I mean, I've seen this before, the exorcism practices of people in various places tend to be very elaborate, very loud, and have a whole lot of parts, a lot of things that you have to do. But what Jesus did is different. And it was the same back in the first century as well. Back in the first century, people who were trying to cast out demons would use names of power to try to do that, like the name of David or the name of Solomon. They would try to use certain songs as words of power against these evil spirits. And they would use maybe some relics or rare items as objects of power. But what's Jesus do? Jesus commands. And that's what we see. It's like a pattern. Wherever you see Jesus speaking to someone who's got an evil spirit, he just says, "Get out." And what do? They get out. They have no choice. That is the authority of Jesus. He demonstrates his authority over spiritual things. And, there's so many, I think, worldview reshaping things going on here, because a lot of us, I think, are also caught in these sort of Greek categories, Greek philosophical categories, where we think that the world is divided into spiritual things and physical things. But that's not quite the view the Bible presents us with either. The Bible presents us with a view that there is a creator and a creation. The creator made his whole creation, and that includes all the physical things and the spiritual things. God made them all. You can find this in the Old Testament. Many times God is actually called the Lord of the spirits. He's the master and the creator of everything. And so if that's who God is, if God is the creator and Lord even over spirits, then Jesus, as God's anointed king, remember we're talking about the Messiah here, as God's anointed king, he has that authority too. And that's why he can speak and dismiss these evil spirits. So spiritual afflictions. There's a lot of different kinds of spiritual afflictions, I think. There's demon possession, which actually is a thing. It happens. There's evil influences that come against us. There are also our own evil desires. That's actually our biggest spiritual problem. This is the way that I think it kind of works. We have our own evil desires that are at work inside of us. And then all these other evil spirits or things or Satan, all they have to do is sort of try to fan those things into flame so that we fall into sin. So we have evil spirits, we have evil desires. Now where does that come from? When the first man and the first woman disobeyed God, they not only died physically, they died spiritually. And so our evil desires, the fact that we can be influenced by evil things, is a result of spiritual death. We're separated from the life-giving Spirit of God, so that we're not only dying physically, but spiritually as well, unless we put our trust in Jesus, and His Spirit comes to us. And, being the Spirit of God, there's no other spirit that can inhabit you when you have the Spirit of God within you. And so the conclusion then is that in Jesus' kingdom, we're not only going to be free from physical afflictions, but we're going to be completely free from spiritual afflictions as well. Our own evil desires, whatever other evil spirits or things there are out there. So let's sort of bring this home now. Right now, in our current condition, even as believers, we are suffering from a variety of spiritual and physical afflictions. Even though I'm a believer in Jesus, I'm still going to die in this world. My body's still going to wear out. I don't know when it's going to happen, I'm still suffering from spiritual afflictions as well. I still have evil desires that, in the power of Jesus, I'm trying to expel. But none of us are going to come to a point where we're completely sinless in this life. Jesus, as our Messiah, as our anointed King, King anointed by God, who's come into the world, He's borne these things on our behalf through His death, and He's taken away the power of them through His resurrection. So while we may still suffer from a lot of different things now, we can also look forward with confidence and hope to a complete wholeness of life in Jesus' kingdom. We can look forward to His real physical kingdom that's going to be filled with living citizens who've been redeemed from sin and death by a real King who died and rose again. That's what we are looking forward to. That is our hope. Now, there's another application to this as well. Because if we have received this hope, if we know that we're going to go on and we're going to live forever in this wonderful kingdom of Jesus, then what have we been able to do with that? We've been commanded to spread that hope. We've been commanded to reach out to other people who don't have that hope yet, with this full message that we are waiting for the return of our King, the real return of our King. He is actually going to come back. Jesus said that they will see the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens, that He's going to be coming on the clouds. So, think about it. How did Jesus leave the earth when He left with His disciples? He sort of floated up into the sky, right? How do you get away from the earth? You go up. So Jesus floated away into the sky. Somehow, someday, He's going to come back, the Bible says, in the same way that He left. So that's what we're looking forward to. We're looking forward to Jesus actually physically coming back and establishing His kingdom. And so we then have this ministry like Jesus. I mean, we don't push back death ourselves, but we tell other people about Jesus, and if they believe in Him, then they're reconnected to His life-giving Spirit. And then they can have that hope and that joy of looking forward and saying, you know what? Yeah, my body's dying. Yeah, I'm spiritually, I'm all messed up. But someday, I will be alive again in His kingdom forever. This slight, as Paul said, slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank You so much for Your word. We thank You so much that Your word explodes our worldview. We thank You so much that there is a real kingdom that You are going to bring. That You're a real King. And that someday we will be alive in Your kingdom forever. Living and working, glorifying You in every way. Lord, help us to live in hope and to spread that hope. We pray these things in Jesus' precious name.